Okay, so our speaker today is Chloe Bribblecombe, who is a postdoc researcher at the Social Complexity and System Transmission Research Group at the Wegener Center at the University of Graz in Austria, and also a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Public Policy. She's a climate scientist and a new title I've never seen before, extreme heat researcher. Unfortunately, we're going to have more of these people, but she's the first extreme heat researcher I know with that title. And she focuses on impacts of heat loss, heat impacts on, especially in pregnant women and children's health. And she previously helped to develop thermal competencies for the European Center for Medium Range, weather forecasts, numerical weather prediction products. Anyway, so thanks so much for joining us, Chloe. We are very happy to listen to you. So please get started. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, extreme heat researcher was a self explanation of what I do. I guess like a hydrologist, I was thinking about how we could describe people that research heat waves. So I'm very happy to be here. So the title of my talk is Tracking Compound Heat and Humidity Impacts. And it will just be an overview of some of the work that I've been doing over the last sort of couple of years. So before we get started, the motivation for my work is really the vulnerable groups to extreme heat. So these are pregnant women, children, infants, babies, the elderly, and also outdoor workers, and also people with pre-existing medical conditions. And this is really what motivates me to do this research, is to see how we can improve climate adaptation measures and also mitigate against climate change to avoid adverse health impacts and also well-being impacts for these groups. So a lot of my work looks at thermoregulation. So thermoregulation is how our body responds in response to heat. This is made up of different meteorological parameters, such as solar radiation, relative humidity, temperature, and also wind speed. What we know is that when we are experiencing excess heat, we have a raise in the number of people experiencing heat illnesses, and also we have a rise in mortality rates. We see this most often in the over 65 age group, but also in those with pre-existing medical conditions. You would also see a rise in hospitalization for children, and this can be from things like respiratory disorders, for children especially, because sometimes when you have high heat events, you also have high compound of air pollution, which is really important to bear in mind. So how can we measure heat? So there are different ways we can measure heat, known as heat metrics. These take into account different meteorological parameters. So for maternal and perinatal health, what we see is 4 different indices being used. These are apparent temperature with and without wind. This also takes into account temperature and humidity. We have heat index, which takes into account wind, relative humidity, and temperature. Wet bulb globe temperature, which I'll be talking to you about a little bit more, which takes into account solar radiation, wind speed, relative humidity, and temperature, and the same in the Universal Thermal Climate Index. So these are already being used by maternal and the child health field, but what we see is that there is a lack of understanding about the methodology around them, and also a lack of understanding of how to use them in comparison to mean temperature, as a lot of people interpret them the same as temperature, as they use the same standard unit as temperature, which is degrees Celsius. So what we see is people comparing them in the same way. However, they're not the same. They are more like a feel-like temperature, which you might see on like AccuWeather, and taking into account heat as a whole of the thermal environment instead of one aspect of the thermal environment. So we had a paper that reviewed papers on this, and basically our recommendation was to use the metrics more often, but also improve education in the field around how to use the heat metrics and what they meant in comparison to temperature, which is something we're working on at the moment. So to talk a little bit more about wet bulb globe temperature. So wet bulb globe temperature is the international standard for occupational health, the heat stress. And we reviewed 913 pieces of literature from Scopus to look at what the vulnerability gaps were for the index. So this was important because of the motivation at the beginning to try and protect the vulnerable groups from heat. You would want there to be research that looked at how wet bulb globe temperature causes health outcomes, but also causes things like people having to take sick days or experiencing dehydration in the workplace. So what we found was a lot of gaps in the literature. So predominantly wet bulb globe temperature is reviewed for people that are from the male sex instead of females. There is quite a few studies now that look at a comparison between male and female response to heat. However, there's still quite a big gap where we historically see more studies for young males. It's thought that this is because quite a lot of the studies come from university or college students, especially in athletics. So people going and finding their friends basically, or a football team and looking how they respond to heat is quite an easier study to do than perhaps looking around for the vulnerable groups, and also you would have ethics and issues that might occur with looking at the vulnerable groups. We also see a gap between age groups, so predominantly studies are for adults. Surprisingly, there isn't a lot of studies for older adult groups. So this is between the ages of 50 and 65. And I'm really sorry, I'm categorizing elderly is above 65 because of that risk that it poses. And if we think about those that are in the workplace in particular, because wet bulb globe temperature is the occupational standard, we might be surprised that there isn't research on the elderly or older adults, because a lot of these people will still be in the workplace. And so we don't know what that risk threshold is for them and how that compares to what is already written in the standards. Another surprising finding was that there is currently only 3 studies on pregnant women at work. And 2 of these studies are from the same place. So what this means is that pregnant women, whilst they're at work, are not being protected necessarily by this international standard. Whereas if you look at international standards in the workplace, such as for lifting, there are categories for children, pregnant women, women, and men. And this is not the case for temperature or thermal comfort yet, which is really interesting and a gap that we think should be resolved urgently, especially as there is building evidence that thresholds could be different between sexes, but also age groups. So another way that I looked at wet bulb globe temperature and what it is. So wet bulb globe temperature is made up of 3 different components. This is a globe thermometer, which is incidence of solar radiation. And this is a globe thermometer. Sadly, we don't see this observed very often. And recently I went to Zimbabwe to run a workshop for my postdoc project. And the head of the Met service there said that often they see these globe thermometers being stolen, which is quite concerning. And then the other component is wet bulb thermometer, which is basically a normal thermometer wrapped in muslin cloth and then kept moist. So what we see is sometimes in the observed record of this at weather stations, if it's in a remote weather station, you can get the same reading as the last component, which is dry bulb thermometer, because they haven't topped up the water, and so it basically dries out and then it can overinflate or give inaccurate recordings of wet bulb globe temperature or wet bulb temperature. So wet bulb temperature in its own right is a survivability index. So if you experience above 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature for 6 or more hours without access to cooling, you basically even see healthy people starting to die. There is a range around this, and there's recent evidence to show that it could actually be a lot lower for some people, like as low as like 32, 33 degrees Celsius, which is quite a big difference to the theoretical 35. We've already started seeing this survivability index being breached in regions like Iraq and Iran, but not for long enough to see basically even healthy people dying. But we do see an increase in heat-related illnesses. And there is a real concern going forward with climate change that this survivability index could be breached for long enough that it makes regions of the world uninhabitable, so people won't be able to live there, and then you'll see an increase in even more of an increase in climate migration and people having to move simply because it's too hot to live in a region. And so these three things together make the wet bulb globe temperature index, which was developed by the US military in the 1950s and 60s. And you have three different types. So you have outdoor wet bulb globe temperature, effective wet bulb globe temperature, which also has threshold limits for rate of work and metabolic rate. And then you also have indoor wet bulb globe temperature, which is slightly different to the one I've showed here, which has different weightings, basically, because you don't have as much of an influence of solar radiation indoors. So those are the three main types. And then the thresholds I've shown here are for an adapted version of wet bulb globe temperature thresholds, which is actually from the Japanese occupational health organization, which doesn't take into account basically acclimatized people, so people that are used to a climate and unacclimatized people, and doesn't take into account metabolic rate. So it's just a way to look at it without thinking about the work rest cycles someone might have to use, which might make it more comparable for, like, say, if someone's experiencing a health illness. So what I did was with a group of people when I was working at the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, ECMWF, we wanted to create a wet bulb globe temperature that worked for gridded data. So methods that have been used previously use long iterative loops to calculate both wet bulb temperature and globe temperature. So what we did is we used an equation that is usually used for mean radiant temperature, which is another way to measure incidence of radiation on a body. And then we resolved this for globe temperature. So this basically gave us a method that didn't have to go through these iterative loops and converge, which is different to what the standard was before, which is known as wet bulb globe temperature. I always get this wrong, so I'm going to say I call him Liljegren, but this is terrible mispronunciation. So this method was from a paper by Guo et al., but it's also seen widely across literature. This paper looks at using ping pong balls actually as a way to measure globe temperature in comparison to the standard thermometer cover, and looked at different dimensions between the standard globe and then also a ping pong ball, because ping pong balls are probably cheaper to produce, especially if they're getting stolen, than the standard measure. And then another part of our new method was to look at the cosine of the solar zenith angle, which is basically the angle of incidence of solar radiation. And basically, there's a method that you can use, but it doesn't integrate properly across gridded data at a time step. So what we did was we use a Gauss-Lenggercher method, and this was developed with at the time my line manager, and basically what we did was we integrated the original method, which was just for 1 point, and then we split this into different parts, and then we just integrated over that. And so how this is different from the gold standard method that's already used is that what they found in that method is that it didn't properly consider the solar zenith angle at sunrise or sunset because it wasn't integrated over the whole time period. And so we improved this in our method so that you can see heat stress basically better at sunrise or sunset. And then our globe temperature method is comparable to another metric that ECMWF use, which is called the Universal Thermal Climate Index, because that uses mean radiant temperature as its primary source of radiation. And so we basically pulled this together and made it more like repeatable. And all of this was released in a Python package called thermofill. And what this does is it gives you different thermal comfort indices, including the one we developed, and it made it reproducible for people using ECMWF products, but this is also in pre-operations, so in testing phase of ECMWF's weather forecasts. So it gave the opportunity for something to be used in a numerical weather prediction setting, and then allow users of that to also use that in their own work. Another thing that thermofill does is you can have gridded data, but you can also have point data, as I used, and you can compare that like for like across the different types of data that you might have, which was not something that we'd seen in libraries before, because usually you'll get it designed for point data, and then, as I said, you'll have to iterate over it, which is not necessarily what you want to do when you have large gridded data sets taking up terabytes or petabytes of space. So then in comparison to Liljigram, we tested this and we found pretty good error margins. So in most regions of the world, it's with 1 degree Celsius of this gold standard metric. However, you see some regions where it's up to 4 or 5 degrees above, but these are in regions of either high elevation or in places where in Error 5 reanalysis data, you already see big biases. For example, the Tibet plateau is crazy. Like, for some reason, it's not that great and there's lots of errors. It's thought to be to do with the parameterization of the model over that specific region. We also tested this against what is called here WBGT ACS M87. This is also known in literature as wet bulb globe temperature simple. And basically, if you look at literature now, what it's telling you is don't use this method. It was designed in Australia. It works, as you can see, quite well in Australia, but not really anywhere else. So don't use it. It was basically the finding of our paper as well.
Can I just ask it? So,
Yeah, sure.
you come with this formula and this analysis. Now, these are gridded, so you're basically using an extrapolation sort of measured on a probably 1 kilometer grid or 5 kilometer grid. I don't know what it is. Did you compare these with the actual field measurements from, wet bulb and globe deployed in, meteorological stations?
Yeah, so I don't have a slide on that, but if you look up the paper, yes, we compared this to weather station data, and what we found was I think it was an RMSC score of about within 4 degrees Celsius. This is kind of it's not as good as you'd want it necessarily, but this is in line with Error 5 reanalysis data as a whole, and also mean radiant temperature. So the method for that is also about a 4 degree RMSE metric. So we did compare that. Actually, one of the issues we had, though, was that we only managed to do it for 2 weather stations because of the globe temperature. Like, it's not recorded basically anywhere. So we had to use like special radiation network data, and then we wanted to compare it for these three heat waves. So we only looked at this, and then the data is basically really like not available for that in the way we wanted. So, but I think they've gone on and they've also gone on and tested this as well with the different wind like parameterization, and so there's further tests ongoing with it. But yeah, we found good agreement when you do this method for observed in comparison to reanalysis as well, which was important. Thank you.
I mean, 4 degrees is quite a lot of error to have, right? And you said only two globe temperature data sets. I mean, I'm sure there are other places which have, they just don't publish the globe data at all. Is that what the problem is?
Yeah, it's the globe temperature. So to make globe temperature, you need well, to make mean radiant temperature, to then go make mean to make globe temperature, you need 5 different parameters of radiation. And basically the one that's missing is downward solar radiation proportion. So downward solar radiation proportion is currently estimated in mean radiant temperature at ECMWF, because it's not been turned on yet in the model. So you don't see that in any other reanalysis product, and you basically, so the way you estimate it is using total sky radiation divided by like cosine of the Zoner-Zeller's angle, and that's what we did. But you very rarely see that specific parameter observed by itself. So one thing that we've thought about doing, and I actually have some colleagues that have done this, is basically in some way estimate mean radiant temperature using a model from its relationship with temperature and the other elements of like wet bulb globe temperature, instead of calculating it, just because it's such a big issue to get that single component. And that would make this adaptable to other reanalysis products, but also against the ZERB data that is available, because you could compare it to temperature in the observed and see whether it was accurate or improve the accuracy indeed, which would be interesting.
Thank you. Okay.
So how we're applying this, so what we're really interested in, there's been a recent paper out inside Advances on tracking the movement of heat waves. So what we're interested in is whether there's a difference in wet bulb globe temperature and also other heat metrics when you use them for heat wave definition. So I heard someone say about EGU. We have a poster at EGU on this. So if you're interested, come along, and your work sounded interesting too. So basically we're comparing 2-meter temperature, which is usually used, and this is the maximum 2-meter temperature above the 95th percentile for 30 years for 4 or more days, in comparison to the 95th percentile of wet bulb globe temperature for 4 more days. And this is simply showing 1 year, but we've done it for a 30-year period. And what we're finding is that there is a slight difference between an index and temperature for indicating number of heat waves. So this is important because if you were to move perhaps your forecasting system or how you're indicating heat risk from temperature to wet bulb globe temperature, you might get differences in your findings. We also looked at this for point data, and we find differences for key cities in Austria. So I'm based in Graz, which is 2.5 hours from Vienna, and we find different number of heat waves for Graz in comparison to Vienna, in comparison to St. Pölten, in comparison to, say, Salzburg. What's interesting about this is that in the recent Science Advances paper, they don't find a difference, or at least they say they don't find a difference for wet bulb temperature in comparison to 2-meter temperature in the movement of heat waves, whereas we actually find that we think that there would be a difference because the number of heat waves recorded is actually different. However, what's different about our method is that we're looking over a whole year period. So we're also looking at warm spells in a winter season, instead of just the summer season. And we think that this may be what's causing the difference, because you might have different factors playing into a heat wave in the winter in comparison to the summer. So that's something we're thinking about looking into further. Also, there's quite good observation data for Austria, and so this is again error 5, but we'd like to expand this to look at observation data because of the errors in error 5 that have been mentioned, especially because in Austria there's like lots of regions of high elevation, and in error 5 this can cause errors in basically how well this is captured, especially as like recently we had Fohn winds causing there to be a higher temperature recorded at night than during the daytime. It actually broke the record. I think it was in January or February for highest temperature recorded, and that specific effect is not well captured in error 5. So it'd be interesting to see how that affects our results. And then so implications for energy systems. So we're basically trying to think about how we could apply this further. So air conditioning is a really controversial topic because it increases the demand for energy, but also can cause localized heating in an area. So basically, you would want to look at wet bulb globe temperature and how little you could turn air conditioning on, or whether you could not use air conditioning at all to have a safe thermal environment. And then another way we're thinking about applying this work at the moment is for greenhouses. So surprisingly, if you have an apple or a tomato, which are actually two of the top exports fruits from Europe, it has quite a similar model for wet bulb globe temperature, because a globe is actually kind of the same shape as an apple or a tomato, and it's just basically to do with the transfer of heat between a body. So what we're interested in looking at is whether you could apply sort of wet bulb globe temperature and parameterize it for things like fruit, vegetables, and also greenhouses. So a lot of fruit and vegetables, such as a tomato, are actually grown in greenhouses across Europe. And this would have issues for energy demands, because currently, basically, tomatoes are probably grown in regions where it's traditional to grow them. However, if you have a heating and it's higher temperature outside than a tomato can cope with, you're going to have to increase the amount of energy that you give to your greenhouse, which could have implications for like local energy systems. And this is actually not really widely looked at. So if you look at AgMIP, which is a climate change agriculture model, they don't consider they do consider tomatoes, but they don't consider them for Europe yet. And they don't consider like apples, really. They don't consider other top exported fruit and vegetables, because clearly food security is mostly based on cereal crops, not fruit and vegetables. But fruit and vegetables are important for nutrition, and also for livelihoods. So it's interesting how much of a gap this is, and also greenhouses. Greenhouses are not included in AgMIP, although AgMIP is meant to be like projections of future climate change and how that affects crop yields. So it could be an interesting gap that we're currently looking into that applies sort of the fundamentals of wet bulb globe temperature to different areas. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for listening. If there's any other questions, you're welcome to ask. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, any questions in the room? And just go ahead, yeah.
You presented at the beginning that you were doing like a comparison between like sexes and like different age groups. Did you like consider like checking different like races? Because I know like some like African American, there's a lot of studies about African American people suffering from different diseases like cardiovascular diseases, which are like some like consequences of exposure to heat. So I don't know if there's anything related to like race in this like regard. Yes.
That's a good question. I didn't look specifically at race, and most of the papers from the literature body didn't consider race, I don't think. We see race being considered in like instance of heat, on whether a woman's going to experience preterm birth, and you're right, we see a rise in risk for Black and Hispanic women, most of the time. But this isn't really widely considered in wet bulb globe temperature literature. What we did look at, like as a secondary bit, is comparing climate zones with thresholds of risk for wet bulb globe temperature. And what we found was that there was different thresholds being used in literature depending on what climate zone the study came from. So that was quite interesting.
Any other questions? Anybody online, you can unmute and ask a question. Okay, so maybe I had a couple of questions. So, Chloe, thank you very much for the work here you talked about. When you talk about WBGT, sorry, wet bulb globe, sorry, I should get this right. Wet bulb globe temperature. The one thing we looked at was survivability versus livability at different metabolic rates. And so there's a paper that came out in 2023. I don't know if you've seen this or not, which plotted the amount of metabolic activity permitted for different wet bulb globe temperatures, actually for different test temperatures and humidity combinations. So if you take the temperature humidity combination, then the wet bulb temperature kind of gives you a line, kind of across that. And that's 35 degrees is traditionally assumed to be the borderline. But what these people have done is to look at recent analyses to show that depending on your age and your activity level, you get different amounts of permitted activity level, because depending on the metabolic rate, you will be creating heat in the body that cannot be dissipated. So if you have a high activity level, the corresponding wet bulb temperature is going to be lower than 30, 35 maybe. And also if you're over 65, the corresponding temperature is lower. So there's some work we're doing, and I'm happy to send you a preprint of this, but we've done some work on looking at how many activities are permitted in a particular building. Looking at essentially building heat, heating up using energy plus simulations and relating that to this. So the point I wanted to make was that, the gridded project you're talking about with this forecast of wet bulb temperatures are very good for outdoors, but when you go into indoors, because of heat buildup, especially over the length of the heat wave, the heat builds up every day a little bit more. Those heat buildups are not captured in the outdoors, and so and also the activity level is not captured either. And so I was wondering whether there was a way to combine this work we've done on indoors with the gridded products, so that we can actually have forecasts which are tailored to building types.
Yeah, so that's something I've actually been discussing. So on our project, we work with the Technical University of Denmark, and that's something we've been thinking about. So they're taking measurements in health facilities in South Africa and Zimbabwe because of what you just said, because indoors is completely different to outdoors and is really not captured in the gridded data. Something we're thinking about looking into is using satellite data and sort of like then surface temperature of roofs, and then whether you can then basically use machine learning to estimate an indoor wet bulb globe temperature and compare this to the observation results. And then you'd be able to use that with reanalysis data set for different building types. So if you're interested in that, we can keep in touch, and we could collaborate on that because it's kind of in an exploratory phase at the moment. It's just an idea that we've had, so it would be great to develop something like that.
What we're doing here is mostly, so the student I was working on, unfortunately, she just finished her master's and left, but she did a master's at ETH in Zurich, and her work was on using building archetypes and doing energy plus simulations. So using physical process simulation rather than doing estimates from observation. But I see that Grace is online. Grace, you had this idea of doing satellite observations of temperature. I wonder what you think about this.
Yeah, I think yeah, full transparency, I didn't haven't explored that so much recently, but I think it's a very interesting idea. And I know that there's like increasing amounts of thermal data that's coming online soon. So some of those like new data feeds might make that like, yeah, really interesting.
I think new satellites are being sent up for specifically for temperature measurement, but I think the grid resolution is not so good. They're at, I don't know, 2 meters, 5 meters. I don't know what the grid picks.
The best one we have at the moment is 90 meters.
90 meters.
Yeah, Aster.
Okay.
Because the problem is like the thermal data, the signal to noise ratio is really low.
Right.
So you have to enlarge the size of the pixel. So
Right.
like all of this high resolution that we see when you get like 30 centimeters.
Yeah.
It's with the technology we have today, it's very unlikely we'll have a thermal sensor mounted on a satellite that will be able to do this.
Right.
Maybe on drones, you
Right.
can get better resolution, but with satellite, the best we have is 90 meters.
Yeah, because the atmosphere, it distorts the signal very badly for thermal.
Yeah, and not just this, because like
the
the amount of energy that is emitted on thermal radiation is very small compared to, for example, optical one. So you have the interactions with the atmosphere, very low amount of energy, then it's really hard to sense with some kind of reliability from space.
So Chloe, is that are you guys taking these into account in your work or?
We would be, but that's an interesting thing because often with the radiation it's really difficult in an urban area because if you have like a globe thermometer in the middle of a street, then you have to take account the radiation that bounces off buildings and then re-hits the globe thermometer. So it's actually a really difficult thing to measure. So the reason I was thinking about using something like surface temperature is because it's widely available and in radiation products. I wasn't as concerned, I guess, with the spatial resolution at this point. I think that if you could prove that you could model successfully like mean radiant temperature at a like larger spatial scale, then the next step would be seeing how you could then downscale that and use that for urban models, I guess, which I know some people that are looking into that as well at the moment and how to put urban models into numerical weather prediction. But yeah, I think it's really tricky. But our first step is to really think about how we can use the outdoor environment to in some way model the response of the indoor environment. Kind of, but it's very preliminary. So I think you guys have probably thought about this a lot more than us.
I think something that I've been looking that people have been using. So instead of using thermal data, using SWIR data, so the short infrared band. So it seems like learning is able because like you can get like really the tail when you have like a body at like 37 degrees, you can have the tail of the radiation that is emitted. And it seems like machine learning can detect the signal, and then you can get much better resolution. So you can get like all of those like 5 meter, 3 meter, or even 20 meter with Sentinel-2, 20 meter with Sentinel-2, yes. So, but like we have to filter what is reflected data and what's like emitted data. And it seems like machine learning can do this. So if you want to increase spatial resolution, I would go for SWIR data.
It's really helpful, thank you. I'll look into that then when we do this.
Okay, I mean, and for just what we're doing here briefly is, we are looking at the outside temperature. So it's given to you in some sense. We're assuming the gridded data is available to us, and we're using that to force the energy plus model, which takes into account outside radiant temperature, and then it has some archetypes for building insulation, on a glass surface, orientation, and so on. And that tells us the indoor temperature in each zone of the architectural place. So the kitchen, in the living room, in the bedroom, we can actually look at the temperatures in each of these zones separately by using a physical model. So that's what we've done using Energy Plus.
It's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what, because I know that there's energy, as you just described, energy models for rooms and like apartments and flats. But I was quite surprised that there wasn't that much on energy models for greenhouses. I know it's a bit, do you know of any?
Greenhouses, no, I really don't know. I mean, greenhouses don't show up in architects, building architects at all. And yeah, I know they're commercially important, but I'm not aware of any models. Amelia, did you have a question?
Oh, no, I just was wondering about the SWIR data. I'd only seen that being used for really high temperatures. Did you have more details about what range of temperatures it's able to detect, Felipe?
So I was seeing people like trying to use SWIR data because like there's some changing in vegetations at temperature when like you have increasing vegetation, and people were trying to use machine learning to use SWIR data to get those changes in vegetation.
Hmm.
And the nice things I was seeing, like when I was exploring the data, when I was comparing JEDI data with SWIR, you get like some correlation with JEDI and SWIR. And also like some kind of like, that's what I've seen, like people are trying to extract the information, but like, I don't know what's the range, but like for forest. So it's
Okay,
temperature, right?
okay, interesting. Yep, thanks.
This paper and send you if I find it on.
Yeah, but I mean, Chloe's interest in crops, right, might be relevant because she's looking at apple trees, which are presumably outdoors. And so apples would certainly be affected by, because the temperature effects with shortwave infrared. Presumably. Yeah. Okay. So Chloe, we have a bunch of remote sensing satellite tech people here. So Felipe is an expert in that, and Amelia has been looking at laser-based remote sensing. So that's sort of the climate people at Cambridge are. I don't see them on this call on this call here, but we do have climate people who do grid data reanalysis, stuff like that, but they're in a different part of the university, right? Any other questions for Chloe?
Not a question, but
Yeah.
I just wanted, there was a company based in the UK that launched a thermal sensor of 3.5 meter resolution. I was working like for the first couple of months and then it failed, but they still have the money, so they said that they're going to try like send more satellites for sensors. Yeah.
Yeah, so
my-
that, oh, sorry, I was just saying that was called Satellite View, and it's their HotSat. But there's also a Cambridge company called SuperSharp that are doing a similar thing, but I think they're still probably about a year off launching.
Okay.
Yeah, Grace also got burnt by this. So, yeah. Anyway, I think we're at the end for questions then. So, Chloe, thank you so much for giving the talk. I hope we will see you in person, but let's thank Chloe again. Thank you. All right, we'll end the
Thank you.
record.